what do you think aliens look like? So we talked about all the different kinds of biosignatures they might leave or technosignatures, but what would they look like when we show up? Are they going to have arms and legs? Are they going to be recognizable at all? Are they going to be carbon-based?
Yeah, so great question. And this question gets to the heart of thinking about life, right? About what life is. And this is the physical part of that. There's also sort of the informational part of it. But let's just talk about the physical part of it, which is, life, anything that we're going to call life is probably going to work on Darwinian evolution. That's the nice thing about Darwinian evolution. Just like we know the laws of physics are general, the laws of Darwinian evolution are kind of this logic, this basic logic, that, anything we'd reasonably call life probably has to operate under these kinds of principles. And so, evolution is about solving problems that, to survive, that the environment presents. And the environment is always going to present these problems in physical and chemical terms, so that you'd expect a kind of balance between what we call convergence, evolutionary convergence, and evolutionary contingency. So, if you've got to move along a surface, a surface between, a hard surface and air, then the idea of some kind of jointed stick, right, legs, makes sense, that you're probably going to trigger that. If you look at Earth's history, multiple times, multiple lineages that had nothing to do with each other are going to solve the problem of getting towards energy sources using some kind of, a stick-like apparatus.
So that's about movement?
Yeah, so that's one problem that has to be solved. One problem that has to be solved is I got to get to food, right? Another problem is I got to get away from predators, right? You've seen wings. We've seen wings. The line that went through dinosaurs to birds involved wings. Insects evolved wings. Mammals evolved wings. If the gas is dense enough that a curved surface, if you move through the curved surface, it's going to produce lift. Yeah, there you go. Evolution will trip on that. So I think you can expect certain classes of solutions to the basic problems that life is gonna be presented with. Stay alive, reproduce. But one of the weird things about with the UFO things is that you always see they all look like humans. They're just basically humans with, triangular heads. And that's where we get to contingency, right? So what we've been talking about is convergence. So you expect that evolution will converge on wings multiple times when presented with the problems that wings can solve. But contingency is accidents, right? That, you've got something that's evolving a certain kind of wing, a leathery wing, right? And then, the climate changes and they all die out. End of story. Or, an asteroid, total accident, asteroid hits. And so contingency, accidents play also a huge role in evolution. And one of the things that, lots of evolutionary biologists have talked about is the idea that if you ran the tape of Earth's history over again, would you get the same creatures? Now, Stephen Jay Gould was of the opinion that no way, that you wouldn't find anything on Earth that resembled any species today. They've done experiments actually on this with E. coli. You take a bunch of E. coli, you let them evolve for a while, you take a bunch of them out, freeze them, let that population continue to evolve. The other one's frozen. Now start it over again with the frozen. And it seems to be that contingency tends to win. Right? The contingency, at least from what we can tell. I mean, that's not a hard result, but in those experiments, what you find is that accidents really do matter. So the idea, and this is important. So yes, you should expect legs or jointed sticks. How many joints they're going to be? Anybody's guess. Do you expect humanoids? Things with a sensing apparatus on top of a shoulder with two arms and two legs. That's probably a pretty random set of occurrences that led to that.
I guess what is a brain versus the nervous system? Where's most of the cognition computation going on?
Yeah.
You could see that in organisms. Actually, I don't know how the brain evolved. Why does it have to be in one place?
Doesn't have to be. So my favorite word of the day is liquid brains, right? This idea of distributed cognition, which fascinating idea. And we've come to understand how much distributed cognition there is. Obviously, eusocial animals like termites, etc., and ants, that's an example of distributed cognition. The organism is the whole colony. This is one thing that's been really interesting in the state of the study when we got to for aliens, is that what we've come to recognize is that human intelligence, it's not actually, it's been the kinds of things that go into intelligence are distributed all across the biosphere. Lots of different examples of things show various pieces of what we have. Jason Wright will describe it as like a deck of cards. The cards are all there. We got the hand that actually led to the kind of technological progress that we see. But the kinds of, the basic idea of using tools, the basic idea of recognizing each other eye to eye, all the things that we define as intelligence, you can find many places in many other places across many other lineages across the earth. So they could be very, very different with something like, maybe that's, the hive mind idea, or, bacterial colonies that actually manage to, come to their own version of high cognition.
Well, I wonder if we stretch out time across tens, 20 billion years, whether there's a Darwinian evolution stops working at some point in terms of the biology or the chemistry of the organisms, and it switches to ideas, for example. It much more rapidly, you're operating, maybe, I guess it's a kind of Darwinian evolution on the space of memes or whatever. As
technology seems to operate on but certainly markets can operate in ways that look very Darwinian.
So basically, a planet is working hard to get to the first kind of organism that's able to be a nice platform for ideas to compete.
Yeah.
And then it kind of stops evolving there. And then it's ideas that take off.
Right. Because, cultural, it's true. It's amazing that cultural evolution totally disconnects from the Darwinian process. But I'd be careful to say that, like, a planet is working hard to do this. Because, it's really important. Looking at us, like, what we think of as ideas and culture, and, it's quite possible we're going to make it another 200 years and this is gone, right? Because it actually wasn't a very good idea long term. I mean, we just don't know.
Oh, so maybe the idea generation organism is actually the thing that destroys.
Not the biosphere, because again, but it destroys itself. It may not be very long term. It may be very potent for a short period of time, but that it's not sustainable. It doesn't become, like we were talking about before, mature. It's very hard to make it integrated into a mature bio/technosphere. And of course, evolution is not working for anything. Well, here's the actually interesting thing, right? So people are very much, evolutionary biologists will get their hair will stand on end if you start talking about evolution having a purpose or anything. But the very interesting thing about purpose is that once you do get to a idea generating species or collective organism, then, kind of all bets are off, and there is goals. There is teleology. There is now suddenly, absolutely there's a direction implied. So that's kind of the cool, interesting thing, that once you get to that, evolution stops being goalless and directionless, and suddenly, we're the ones who supply, or any kind of creature like us has an absolute direction that way they decide on.
Although you could argue that from a perspective of the entire human civilization, we're also directionless. We have a sense that there's a direction in this cluster of humans.
Yeah.
And then there's another cluster that has a different sense of direction. There's all kinds of religions that are competing. There's different ideologies that are competing.
Yeah.
And when you just zoom out across, if we survive across thousands of years, it will seem directionless. It will seem like it's a pinball.
It's an unholy mess. But, but at some point, like the expansion into the solar system, say, like that would be both direction. I mean, depending on how you look at it, it was directional. There was a decision that the collective of human beings made to, like, anti-accrete, to start spreading out into the solar system. So there was definitely a goal there that may have been reached in some crazy sort of, non-linear way, but it was still, right? It's still a goal was set and it was achieved.
If there's advanced civilizations out there, what do you think is the proper protocol for interacting with them? Do you think they would be peaceful? Do you think they would be warlike? Like, what do we do next? We detect a civilization through all the technosignatures we've been talking about. Maybe direct imaging, maybe there's really strong signal. We come up with a strategy of how to actually get there.
Yeah.
But what's then the generals, as they always do, the military industrial complex.
We've watched that movie.
Where, what kind of rockets? And do we bring rockets?
Right. Well, I think, so this general question also leads to messaging extraterrestrial intelligence. And I am definitely of the opinion of, like, you should be very careful. Like, I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea to have your head below the grass. The people who advocate, like, oh yeah, we should be sending, powerful messages that are easily detectable into interstellar space. I'm like, why would you? Because we just don't know. Like, I'm not going to say they are warlike. I'm not going to say they're not warlike. I have no idea, but we sure as hell Well, first of all, who gets to decide that? The idea that a bunch of astronomers who happen to have a radio telescope, I don't, who speaks for Earth? Which I think was a great book somebody wrote. So I definitely we should be cautious, I would say, because we just have zero information. And the idea, you used to have this idea of, well, if they're advanced, they've managed to survive, so of course they're going to be wearing togas, and be singing Kumbaya. But I just wouldn't assume that. It's also possible, though, that like their cognitive structure is so different that we're not even living in the same universe in a certain way. I think we have to be prepared for that. We may not even be able to recognize each other in some way as cognizing beings. One of my favorite movies is Arrival. I don't know if you've ever seen that one. I really love that one because, they have a different language. They have a different cognitive structure in terms of their language, and they're literally kind of living in a different physics.
Different physics, different language, different everything.
Yeah.
But in the case of Arrival, it can at least like recognize that they're there.
Right. And they managed to cross the language barrier. Yeah.
So, but that's both sides have an interest in communicating, which you kind of suppose that an advanced civilization would have a curiosity. Because like, how do you become advanced without a kind of curiosity about the mysterious, about the other?
But also, if they're long-lived, they may just be like, we're not even interested. Like, we've done this. We're like, 10 billion years, or sorry, say 10 million years ago, we were really interested in communicating with you, youngins, but now we're not at all. And that's just, one of the beauties of this, again, is how to think about this systematically, because you're so far past the hairy edge, right, of our experience of what we know that you want to think about it, right? You don't want to be like, don't know, can't say anything, because that's not fun. But you also have to sort of systematically go after your own biases, right? So one of the things I loved about Arrival, too, was, Carl Sagan always had this idea, like, we'll teach them math. We'll teach them our math. Then they'll teach us their math. And then, we'll be telling each other knock-knock jokes, and swapping cures for cancer. And, in the movie, like, they send a Carl Sagan guy in and a linguist. And the Carl Sagan guy fails immediately, right? And it's the linguist who understands that language is actually embodied. Language is not just something that happens in your head. It's actually the whole experience. And she's the one who breaks through. And it just points to the idea that how utterly different the cognitive structures of a different species should be. So somehow we have to figure out how to think about it, but be so careful of our biases, or figure out like a systematic way to break through our biases and not just make science fiction movies. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Speaking of biases, do you think aliens have visited Earth? You've mentioned that they could have visited and started civilizations, and we wouldn't even know about it if it was 100 million years ago. How can we even begin to answer this question?
Got to figure out ways to look. So I don't put it, it's not high on my list of, things that I think are probable, but it needs to be explored, and unless you look, you never know. So looking on the moon, look at where would we find if aliens had passed through the solar system anytime in the last 3 billion years, where might we find artifacts? Where might artifacts still be around? Earth, probably not, because of weathering and resurfacing. The moon's a good place. Certain kinds of orbits, maybe they parked a probe in an orbit that was stable. So you got to figure out which orbits actually you could put something there and it'll last for 1 billion years. So those are the kind of questions I don't, like I said, it's not high on my list of thinking this could happen, but it could happen. I certainly can't, unless you look, you don't know.
What about, speaking of biases, what about if aliens visiting Earth is the elephant in the room? Meaning like the potential of aliens, say, seeding life on Earth.
You mean like in that directed panspermia?
Panspermia.
Yeah.
Or seeding some aspect of the evolution.
Like 2001.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a great story, but always with Occam's razor or whatever with science, if I can answer that question without that extra very detailed hypothesis, then I should. And the idea that evolution is a natural process, that's what I would go for first, right? There's that just seems it's so much easier to do it that way than adding, sort of, because it's kind of a deus ex machina thing of like, oh, then the aliens came down and they solved that problem that you're trying to solve by just coming down and putting their finger on the scales.
So to you, the origin of life is a pretty simple thing that doesn't require an alien.
I wouldn't say that. It's not a simple thing, but it doesn't, I think, because, all you're doing is kicking the can down the road, right? The aliens formed, right? So you're just saying like, all right, I'm just kicking the can down the road to the aliens. What was their abiogenesis event?
Well, so from a different perspective, I'm just saying it seems to me that there's obviously advanced civilizations everywhere throughout the galaxy and through the universe from the Drake equation perspective. And then if I was an alien, what would I do? I've gotten a chance to learn about the uncontacted tribes in the Amazon. I recently went to the Amazon. You get to understand how they function and how the humans in the Amazon that are in contact with the civilized world, how they interact with the uncontacted tribes. First of all, the uncontacted tribes are very violent towards the outside world, but everybody else try to stay away from them. They try to kind of protect them, don't talk about them, don't talk about their location, all this kind of stuff. And I've begun to internalize and understand that perspective of why you're doing that. And if I was an alien civilization, I probably would be doing a similar kind of thing. And of course, there's always the teenager or the troll who's going to start messing with this stuff, or the scientist.
Right.
And so it's not, from our perspective, yes. And if you're in the Truman Show, like Occam's razor, but like also the Occam's razor from the perspective of the alien civilization, we have to have the humility to understand that interaction will be extremely difficult to detect. That it would not be obvious.
Right. I understand the logic of what you're saying, but the problem for me with that is that right there, first you have to assume that alien civilizations are common, which I'm not sure about it. That most of them may be dead, or they're not. It's still, like while I think that life is common, and again, this is just my biases, right? So now the problem is, how do we sort out sort of, the biases we're bringing or the assumptions we're bringing in from the sort of causal chain that comes out of that. I would first want to try and do this without, if we're looking at the origin of life or the evolution of life on Earth, I'd want to do it just on its own without asking for this other layer. Because it requires a bunch of these other assumptions, which also have their own sort of breaking of causal chains. Because I don't really like the idea that when you ask, what would you do if you were an alien? But again, like alien minds could be so unbelievably different, right? That they wouldn't even recognize the question you just posed, right? Because it's just like, we have a very particular kind of cognitive structure, and we're very governed by, even if you went and talked to, this is an interesting thing to think about. If I could suddenly magically appear 100,000 years ago and talk to a hunter-gatherer about their worldview and their motivations, I might find something that's like bore no resemblance to things that I think are sort of, that's what naturally humans do.
Well, let me ask you this question. Let's together do the thought experiment.
Yeah.
If we either create a time machine that allows us to travel back and to talk to them, or we discover maybe a primitive alien civilization on a nearby star system, what would we do?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, so, it's interesting how that even brings up the ethical questions, right? Let's say that, we'd have to first sort of sort out what are the consequences for them and what do we feel our ethical responsibilities are to them.
And also, from a capitalist perspective, what are we to gain from this interaction?
Right. You look at the way the missionaries had these interactions because they thought converting them to whatever religion they were, was the most important. That's what the gain was. So from our perspective, I mean, we'd have to sort that out. I think given, if we're doing this thought experiment, we are curious. And I think eventually we'd want to reach out to them.
Now, I think when you say we, let's start with the people in this room, right? But I wonder who the dominant forces are in the world, because I think there's a lot of people, the military, they will probably move first so they can steal whatever advantage they can from this new discovery so they can hurt China or China hurt America. That's one perspective. Then there's the capitalists who will see like how the benefits and the costs here and how can I make money off of this? There's opportunity here. There's gold in them hills. And I wonder, and I think the scientists is just not going to, unlike the movies.
We're not going to get much say.
They're going to put them.
Hey guys, wait a minute.
They would engage probably. I mean, it's just as a human society as we are now, we would engage, and we would be detectable. I think, like
in our engagement. Yeah, probably.
So using that trivial biased logic, it just feels like aliens would need to be engaging in a very obvious way.
Yeah.
Which brings up that old direct Fermi paradox for me.